The greatest problem that exists is the problem of the moral ought. Most people do not even understand the problem or that it exists. This ignorance is the result of an atheist mindset. If there is no God, there is no moral ought. The only concern of a materialist is to remain alive. This desire to live does not rise to the level of a moral ought, it is more along the lines of an unavoidable necessity. We need to stay alive because there is no moral necessity to die. Staying alive is the first-order principle, and to flagrantly disobey that principle is beyond us. The moral ought does not replace the first-order principle of survival, it is a reinterpretation of what life means. For many of us, we believe life is consciousness. Life is the awareness of life. For many, this awareness of life is enough. However, the awareness of life inevitably makes one aware of impending death. As we are aware of life, we also become aware of factors that threaten to take life away. We need to eat, sleep, and drink. We need to keep life in an environment that is conducive to life. However, the ability of life to maintain life is limited in most cases. Civilization exists only where life has risen to a whole new level. Life has taken on a whole new meaning when we acquire civilization. In a civilized society, life means more than simply the maintenance of self-awareness, or a consciousness of self. Whatever atheists think of the conception event, man as an organism is far more than a clump of cells. Sustaining the cells of a person is not sustaining human life. Surely there is a moral obligation to preserve human life in the fullest sense of the word. Yet history and logic does not bear this assumption out. There has never been a time that human life was not treated contemptuously for the most part. Mankind has always been tribal and limited in his capacity to extend empathy to all. The fact that we contend that murder is wrong and is a universal position is said as a way to convince ourselves there is a floor to our abasement of others, beyond which no one will go. But we know this is just not the case. Murder as a universally abhorred event is true only in the most general of senses. Murder is a word because it happens all too often, along with genocide, and everything in between. There is no true sanctity of human life. The frequency with which abortion and human trafficking enters into the spotlight is further evidence of how low human life is valued. The law forces us to consider human life and to treat it as something valuable, but without the law, would life be given the consideration it is now given? Probably not. If it was not trite to say so, we could say the traffic laws are a universally valued good. But we only follow them because we must. Perhaps we could argue we ought to obey the rules of the road, as we say we ought to value human life, but to argue the ought of something, is to admit many fail to honor the principle. If there is no moral principle or moral ought, then nothing is wrong, other than from a legal standpoint. A moral ought needs to exist, to guide us forward. We cannot prove anything is wrong nor that a law is itself wrong, if there is no moral ought to refer to. The moral ought is an absolute standard against which everything else is compared. Atheists often think they have the right and the means to criticize God. This is absurd, but atheists do not comprehend the notion of a moral standard greater than their own predilections. The moral ought cannot be a product of a physical world nor of physical processes. There is nothing that may not be but ought to be in a physical system. Ought is a moral judgment and applies to a sentient consciousness and conscience. The moral ought requires a sentient being to look at what is and comes up with what ought to be different. This is a mental process, not a physical one. The moral ought is neither relative nor partial. If a thing ought to be, it is not just an option nor an element in a basket of positive things. In some ways the moral ought is tantamount to a physical law, such as the law of gravity, except that it is only an absolute for sentient beings. There are no moral absolutes in nature. Those who want to take us back to nature want to eliminate all moral oughts, then they declare they know good from evil. What they mean is that they want to be God, they want to represent the moral ought. If there is no God, then there is no moral ought, and if there is no God and no moral ought, we need a human to take the place of God. Sometimes this role is not taken up by a single person, but several offices combine to fill the role. For example, the presidency, the legislature and judiciary combine to serve as the constitutional God for America. In conjunction they fulfill the role that God ought to serve. However, people who subscribe to the idea of a physical reality and the necessity of the law of the jungle, are not as powerful as God, nor as smart. Regardless of their office, humans invariably remain human with all of humanity's weaknesses and foibles. Their ability to fulfill the role of God is sorely limited. Invariably human rulers must resort to force. Inevitably the force any one person can exert, is very limited. Therefore, the prospective ruler has to form alliances. These alliances are only formed with people who obtain a benefit from the alliance. In short, those who take up office invariably expect to obtain more than they give. The law of the jungle is the idea that power justifies itself. This is encapsulated in the aphorism that might makes right and the end justifies the means. The individual, regardless of who he is, can do little by himself and nothing if there is a solid front opposed to him. The moral ought for a human ruler is simply to hang on to power by whatever means necessary. The very nature of human power requires a pragmatic approach and an ethical code that is highly flexible. The leader does and says what is needed to retain power. But what if a person believes there is a right and wrong that is objective and beyond his own personal best interest? What if the ruler believes it is not right to lie, even when the lie would benefit him personally? It is difficult to imagine what impact this would have on the people because it is a next to impossible situation, since people do not always lie when they say things which appears to misrepresent the facts. Sometimes they are mistaken. Sometimes those who are critical of them, are themselves in error. A more important question is in what system could this happen? Because it would not happen in a system where might is considered the measure of what is right. In such a system no one is going to do that which would make them weaker or less powerful. The very fact that telling the truth makes a person more vulnerable would eliminate it as a strategy for someone who thinks political power is the measure of whether a strategy is right or not. Therefore, the law of the jungle under which all non-Christians live, precludes the existence or at least the employment of, a moral ought. We can claim we wish to be happy, or successful, or honorable or anything else we wish. We can claim there is a first-order principle, such as live as if our actions will become a universal law, but ultimately there is nothing that stops us playing the odds and fouling this moral ought for short-term gain. Even if we are to live according to the golden rule, does it not benefit us if we pay lip service to this principle while betraying those who are attempting to live by it? In other words, even if we are to live honestly, what prevents us from not living by it? Who or what defends this moral ought from those who break its ideals? We are told that murder is universally disapproved of, but in the end if the state does not make murder illegal and rigidly define what it means by this, murder does not exist, in the sense that murder is actually a legal term that requires statutory specifications. The populace might claim a killing is murder, but this in no way prevents another group from saying it is justified homicide. Which ultimately means the side that can kill the other in the shortest amount of time proves the argument they make. In short, a moral ought defined by regulation depends on the power of an enforcement body to give it the strength of an injunction. Thou shalt not kill is just a point of view without a process of enforcement. Therefore, in this world, a moral ought is nothing more than an injunction the state or other enforcement body protects using whatever means is necessary. But this only begs the question, is a moral ought based on the power of arms truly moral, never mind a moral ought? To possess a moral ought, it must be intrinsic to the law. If the moral ought is transcendent, then conflicting with it brings no penalty so long as the law can be skirted. If a couple live off-grid and the female become pregnant and has a baby without anyone other than her and the husband knowing, the baby can be disposed of without any legal repercussions. Therefore, the moral injunction against murder would be null and void. How is that? What we need to do is divide ethics from morality. Ethical systems are legal systems. They require a legislative authority and an enforcement arm, or judiciary. Despite all of the legal trappings, the entire edifice is nothing more than the law of the jungle legitimized through various covenants. Democracy is just a way to decide which faction will hold power, without the need for a civil war. But to make this work, the faction that loses has to accept that they will be subject to the rules and dictates of the winning group. This willingness to accept defeat, at least for a few years, is less evidenced in recent years. The claim elections are stolen, or the ruling party is engaging in unfair practices to swing the results, is more common. But if this reticence to abide by the outcome of an election continues, how will communities decide who is to rule? Eventually, civil war will erupt, and who rules will be decided by who is able to kill the opposing side the fastest. In other words, the law only works if everyone under the law is prepared to obey the law. Without the consent of the governed, the law is just so much print on so much paper and is largely irrelevant. We need a moral law independent of the law. The moral law must also be independent of the judiciary, police, or any other enforcement body. If the moral law needs to be enforced, it must be interpreted, and if the moral law relies on the interjection of human agents, it is nothing more than a human idea, only as valid as the ability to enforce it. The moral law is akin to gravity, in that it is and must be integral to the community of men. If we offend the moral law, the repercussions follow from the path taken apart from God. The moral law must be divinely inspired or created. The moral law must be as intrinsic to reality as energy or motion. If we simply say the moral law is something like, be happy, this becomes relative to the person's wants. We cannot be free to have whatever moral principle we wish to live by or solely responsible for our compliance. There needs to be objectivity, and this means the moral law must be quantifiable. The moral law must be transcendent, because if intrinsic to us or attached to us as a feature of our being, it becomes introspective and ultimately self-justifying. Therefore, the only possible source of a moral law is God. Without God, morality does not exist as a useful concept. If we even have a desire to be moral, we must accept that God exists. Interestingly, those who claim God is not moral suggest he has no right to do what he does. Atheists claim at least some of God's actions lack legitimacy. But this argument is based solely on emotional criteria and the implication that the atheist thinks his emotions trump the rights of God, the Creator. Christians argue that because God is the Creator, his rights are inalienable and unqualified. This means as a creator we have rights to what we create. The moral law is simply the position that a creator has a moral right to whatever he creates. The moral law supports the Christian's attitude to his creator, for the moral law states we must act as if the person who created the thing has absolute and uncontested rights over that which he or she created. As the Creator, God has absolute rights over all he created, and as a created being, mankind has absolute rights to whatever he creates. The moral law requires we never take or make a claim to anything we did not create, and this changes everything.